let's see. So we spoke yesterday about throwing bread, and it seemed like there's a Sephardic custom to throw the bread. However, I did look it up, and I saw from the Rabbi Ovadia Yosef website, it's a halacha website that bases their laws on Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, was probably the leading halachic authority for Sephardic Jewry, I believe, and he really was an encyclopedia of halacha. His name was Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. His son is the chief rabbi now of Israel, and Rabbi Ovadia Yosef was a previous Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel, and he was really an encyclopedia. He wrote, he summarized all halachic authorities and put them in two major works of multiple volumes each. And anyway, they write over here that while distributing pieces of bread to the members of one's household, some have the custom that the head of the household throws the bread to those who are sitting far from him. Is that practice correct or not? So the answer they give is in the halacha published this past Thursday. So this is, I guess they send out emails of their daily halachas. So they said, we have explained generally the basic laws of prohibition of treating foods in a degrading manner. And they bring a Gemara that we're in about 10 pages from where we are. The Gemara over there says that one may not throw bread. And the Gemara explains further regarding all types of food, the prohibition to throw them depends on whether or not doing so, if it will ruin the food. So for instance, some figs will surely be damaged if they are thrown, even if it's on a clean table. However, if it seems that throwing the food will not cause it to be ruined, such as throwing candies on a groom when he gets called up to the Torah, right? The Ufraf, they throw bags of candies, or they throw candies themselves, just candies or nuts or whatever. So there is no such prohibition because it's not going to get ruined. This does not constitute disrespect for the food. Now, regarding bread, however, the commentaries and the Gemara disagree. According to Tosfos, even if the bread will not be ruined as a result of throwing it, like if you throw it from one side of the table to another, it's not going to ruin the bread. It is still, and people will still eat it, but it is still forbidden to do so, according to Tosfos, for bread has a special significance. Throwing it is considered demeaning. The Rush, the Tur, and other great Rishonim rule likewise. On the other hand, the Rashba and Rabbeinu Yoina, two other major commentaries, write that there is no distinction between bread and other foods. As long as the food is not ruined by throwing it, it is permissible to do so. Based on this, throwing pieces of bread from one end of the table to another is absolutely forbidden, whereas according to the Rashba, it's permissible. Bottom line, he says, the halachically speaking, it seems from the wording of the Shulchan Aruch that he rules in accordance with Tosfos, and one should be strict with regard to not to throw bread, even on the table. Many Achreinim rule likewise. Harav David Yosef, who's, I guess, the chief rabbi's, the Rabbi Ovadia Yosef's son, who maybe is the current chief rabbi. I don't know his first name. Which one is it? Rabbi David Yosef? I don't know if anyone knows. He has a lot of sons who are great scholars, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. One of them is the chief rabbi, but he says, Harav Hagoyin Harav David Yosef Shlita rules accordingly in his halacha brura, which means that they seem to hold you're not allowed to throw the bread. Although there are poskim who justify the custom of throwing it from one end to the other, one should nevertheless abstain from throwing the bread completely. This applies especially to the bread eaten during the Shabbos meals, upon which the head of the household recites a bracha in order to fulfill the mitzvah. In such an instance, the Pri Megadim writes that even according to the Rashba, it's forbidden to throw the bread, for this constitutes degradation of a mitzvah. Several other Achreinim rule likewise. So it seems like there's question about throwing bread, that custom. Normally, we don't speak negative about Jewish customs, but it seems that the leading Sephardic poskim seem to question or want to say it's a problem. They want to prohibit maybe throwing the bread, especially the challah bread that you recite the bracha on, from especially because you recited a bracha on it. But in addition to that, there is a major argument among the rabbis if in general one would be allowed to throw bread because bread has special rules to it that you wouldn't be allowed to throw it. So yeah, I'm not really sure if there's other great scholars that argue on this, but from what I see here, it seems like maybe Rabbi Ovadia Yosef wanted to stop that custom. That's what it seems like they want to, but I don't know, this is we're just discussing the Sephardic custom. It's not really, I don't really know the inside, if there's any other side discussion about it. But it seems to be questioned here because of those reasons. Yes, Ben.
I wanted to say I personally didn't like it. I felt, somebody throwing something at you, food at you. It's not really showing kavod.
Right. Well,
a Sephardic friend of mine who does have this custom said that the concept behind it is that the food is not coming from you, the person who has the bread, and giving it to the guest, that the bread is coming from Hashem. So you're taking yourself out of the equation in a sense by sort of throwing it to them. That was her explanation of the
Hashem
rationale.
doesn't throw it.
Well, that's a nice explanation, but the question is if there are sources. Again, it's nice if what we feel and whatever, these are nice ideas. The question is if there are halachic authorities that are going to uphold this custom or not. And I don't know if there's another side to this equation. At least this is what I was able to pull up. Just did a little of my homework. If anyone else did any homework and found anything, that would be we'd be happy to listen and hear their sides. But thank you, Simone. That's an interesting thought that the logic, the logic for it. I don't think that would in any way allow it. In other words, that's not enough of a source to allow it. But it just sounds like a nice thing. So thank you for sharing it. Yes, Susan.
I think there's an issue with the way we're talking about this. You're saying throwing the bread, but tossing it or making sure it gets to the person, maybe they're not throwing it. Throwing it to me means overhand and throwing. What I'm thinking is that maybe it's not really thrown, it's tossed just to make sure the person gets it.
Susan,
Okay.
you're going to have to go to different people's households for Shabbos, and you'll be able to tell us if they tossed it, if they throw it. We're not going to start dreaming
All right.
what
I have
what
another
they really
question.
do. You know what I mean?
I have
There's
another
a-
question.
From one
Yes.
to the other.
I have another
In
question.
Yiddish, it's called a kasha of a maisa. You're wondering, well, making decisions. This is the fact. It's a fact. This is what goes on, And,
Okay.
if you call it this way, they call it that way. The truth is, the Shulchan Aruch doesn't differentiate your type of throwing or tossing. I don't know if there's a difference in Hebrew. I don't know the underhand and overhand. And if you throw it like
The point,
a
all right,
baseball game.
all right, I have another question.
Yes.
This, is there a specific size that the challah must be for Friday night? Size.
Right. I'm not aware of any specific rule. I'd have to look it up. If you want to make it really small, I mean,
Yes, it's only for me.
right. But how small are you talking? In other words,
Maybe
the only
6
question
inches,
what?
maybe 6 inches big.
Yeah, that's for sure fine. The only question in my mind might be if can you make a challah if it's less than the size of a kazayas?
No.
Like the
That's
size
not-
of an olive, would
No,
that
no,
be
that's
called
not what
a
I'm-
loaf of bread because it's not even like enough to eat? You know what I
No.
mean? So I have to look up if that would be considered a
No,
shalom.
I'm just
challah.
talking about a
It's so
small challah, not,
Yeah. A small challah, a small roll. A
Yeah,
roll is
right.
considered
right.
a challah. Yeah. But if you want to make it the
Brutally.
size of a penny or
No.
a dime,
No.
that I don't know. I have to
No.
look up if there is any source. Yes, Yehuda, you had a question?
No, you just answered it.
Oh, okay. Okay, so that was the regarding throwing the challah. The other thing we spoke about yesterday was about feeding animals. Feeding animals before you eat yourself. So it's interesting. There's a whole there is a whole article by the Star K about all the rules of you should consider before you decide to have a pet. And one of the things that they talk about is Pesach with regard to pet food. Another issue they deal with is regarding feeding animals on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Another question is, what about feeding them milk and meat? Would a person be allowed to feed the animals milk and meat? Because milk and meat you're not allowed to get benefit from. So it's not just a prohibition of eating, there's a prohibition of benefiting from milk and meat, which also means that there would be a problem to feed a worker of yours if you're obligated to feed them lunch. If you feed them a cheeseburger sandwich, that would be prohibited because you're benefiting, because you're giving them a meal of cheese and meat, which at least could be a problem. Obviously, we'd have to look it up and see if there's any leniencies there, but just thinking about it, it sounds like it's a problem. It sounds prohibited because you're benefiting from milk and meat. And then they talk about the other issue is feeding animals first. And so they mention here that the Gemara states one must feed his animals before he eats himself. And this is learned from the order of the verse found in Kriya Shema, right, which we did yesterday, that it says that I will give Esav, like vegetation, some type of produce, Esav from your field, to your animals, and you will eat and you will be satisfied, which means that first the animals get fed and then you get fed. And so some authorities say that this is actually a biblical obligation, that the animals have to be fed before the master. And while others, most understand it to be a rabbinic in nature, that it's based on the verse, but it's really a rabbinic obligation. And now this halacha applies to one's animals, birds, and even fish, if they depend on that person to feed them. Now, the importance of this requirement is seen from the following halacha, which is what we just learned. Normally, one who speaks between reciting a bracha and taking a bite of food must make another bracha. However, if the interruption was made in order to tell someone to feed the animals, then you don't need to repeat the bracha. That's what we learned yesterday. Now, on the other hand, one is permitted to drink before giving his animals to drink. Now, what is the source of this permissibility, for this exemption, that one can drink before your animals drink? It's a story in the Torah about someone feeding their animals.
I know.
Or feeding someone's animals. Yes, Ben.
When Jacob went to Lavan, his daughter came with a sheep, and she told Jacob, I'll give you to drink, and then I'll feed your camels, and then I'll let the camels drink. That's
the story, but the wrong names. It's Rivka, and Eliezer.
With Eliezer.
Yeah.
Okay.
When
But
Eliezer
the same
came,
thing probably happened with Jacob.
Right. It's the story with Eliezer that
Right.
she came and she said, "V'gam ligmalach, I'll give you to drink, and also your camels I'll give to drink." Right, and now
it's a song actually now.
So there you see that that you can drink before your animals. Now, one of the reasons why it would be permissible is because drinking, what would the logic be? Drinking, one won't get so involved in, as opposed to eating, they would get more likely to get involved in, and then the animal will go hungry. Now, what happens if your children need to eat and your animals need to eat at the same time? Who comes first? So one must first feed the children if they are incapable of feeding themselves. Now, this commandment does not obligate a person to feed his animals every time he eats. Each animal has a different feeding schedule. So how does this work? What does it mean that you have to feed the animals before you eat yourself? So it says the obligation is that before one eats, you have to consider whether the animal also needs to be fed. If the animal also needs to be fed, then you have to attend to it. One need not attend to feeding himself. You may appoint someone else for this. Additionally, must ensure that the needs of the animals are taken care of if they should become hungry at any other time of the day. Even if one is fasting, he must attend to the needs of his pets. Anyway, so there's a lot to look into. If anyone does have pets, they should realize that it doesn't come without halachic issues that they have to make sure to figure out, so that they don't transgress any of the
If you don't do it,
they want to have a pet.
if you don't do it to your pets, they come to the table and jump on it when the food is there.
It sounds like you have experience. So, so that's just to give you a little halachic, like halachas that are practical that we're learning now, and to just open up the.
Rabbi, could I ask you one thing? You said that you also the birds, that you need to leave food out for the birds. You said that
not for the stray birds, for the wild birds, for your birds that rely on you, the ones you lock in your cage. You got to feed them, otherwise they have no other source of food. But not the birds that come to your front lawn.
Right, I see. Okay. Well, it just so happens I do have a bird, and in order for him to be happy, he needs to see other birds. So I do feed the wild birds that come, and I have sparrows that live in a bush. Right. And makes him happy to see the other, to see the other similar animals.
Right. But the point is, right, so that's very nice.
I have to feed him
your
first,
responsibility
right.
is the bird that you're locking up.
Right.
It's relying on you for food.
Exactly.
Okay. So we said that we started the Gemara on 40a yesterday. Actually, we did one more piece I should go over on 39b. We mentioned about the Eruv bread, that when the Eruv bread was in the house of Rabami and Rabasi, so they recited Hamaitzi on it and ate it. And the reason was because once you do a mitzvah with something, you should use it again for a mitzvah. And we gave a few examples. And then we came to 40a, page 40a. We spoke about interrupting the bracha. So we mentioned here that Rav says that if you said take the blessed bread, and in between, after you already said the Hamaitzi bracha, you tell your guest to take the blessed bread, even though you didn't eat any yet, you interrupted your bracha. Nevertheless, Einoi Tzarech Levarech, you do not need to recite the bracha again. So you told him, take the blessed bread, and now you go and you want to eat your piece. You don't have to repeat the bracha. Commentaries discuss, why does he say it twice? Why didn't he just say it once? Said it twice, interrupted. The extra interruption. So one explanation is that it's teaching you that if that's the normal way to speak, that you say things twice, that you say certain things twice, that's acceptable also. Or another explanation is that even though it's longer than toich kedei dibur, there's a certain measurement of time in Jewish law that often can be used as an opportunity to like retract from something. If you did something, you could change it within toich kedei dibur, within the amount of time it takes to say like 3 words. So here it gives an example of 4 words, emphasizing that even though you missed that it was not considered such a small, like toich kedei dibur is like such a small period of time, you could say it's insignificant. So the same thing you could say, maybe these, if you only said toil baruch, you might say, oh, that's why you interrupted, you don't have to repeat the bracha because you only said 2 words. It's within the toich kedei dibur, it's within the 3-word time limit or 3-word limitation. It's within that, so it's no problem. What happens if you said 4 things? Let's say you said, come sit down and eat. So in that case, you missed. You might think that maybe it's not good enough and you have to repeat the bracha now because you said maybe 5 words instead of 3, the 3-word limit. So therefore, the Gemara gives an example where you said toil baruch. In any event, the Gemara says that for saying that, you do not need to repeat the bracha. If you did say bring salt or bring lifton means something that you eat the bread with, like a dip. So if you said that, then you do have to repeat the bracha according to Rav. And this is not l'tzairech habracha. This is not needed for the for the bracha, because you could eat the bread without the salt, but the guest, you said the bracha on the hamaitzi. Now the guest needs to have the bread. So the bread, you have everything to go to Aso and to bring salt. That's like an additional thing. He doesn't need it. He can just eat the bread. So there, it's not considered necessity for this bracha for the bread, but it is considered a necessity to get the bread to the guest. So, and invite the guest to eat, to partake of the bread. So that would be considered a necessity of this bracha hamaitzi, but the salt would not be, according to Rav. Then Rabbi Yochanan says that no, salt is also a necessity. It's you're supposed to eat the bread in a way that's honorable for the bracha, that it's gonna honor the bracha with something like tasty. It should have a little salt in it, and some lifton, some dip or so. So that would be considered a tzairech of the bracha. It's a necessity. So Rabbi Yochanan says that salt would be also okay if you said it and you don't have to repeat the bracha. But gabil l'sayri, gabil means knead the bran with water and give it to the shar, to the ox. You gotta feed the animal. You gotta feed the ox. And so knead the dough, knead the bran to feed the ox, mix the bran and feed the ox. That would be considered something not necessary for your bracha, because you should recite. You set a bracha on hamaitzi. You eat the bread. Well, you need to go feed the ox. But the next opinion, Rav Shesha says, yes, you need to feed the ox. As the Gemara continues, he says it's not considered an interruption because Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav says a person's obligated to feed the ox before he himself eats, and it gives that verse that we mentioned, that it gives a verse that says you do have to feed the ox before you eat. And therefore, a person must, you have to, make sure that the ox has food, and therefore you would be exempt from repeating the bracha if you said feed the ox before you actually ate. But what it sounds like is you even should do this. Feeding the ox is an obligation. It could be even biblical. There are different opinions, but there is even an opinion that's biblical. You need to feed the ox before you eat. So if you said a bracha, sounds like maybe you should even feed the ox, make sure the ox is fed before you actually partake of the bread. And this is the necessity of the bracha, because you can't eat before feeding the ox. Now, the question is, what do the other views hold? What do the other views hold? What does Rabbi Yochanan hold? What does Rav hold? So Rabbi Yochanan, it would seem, doesn't hold that there's an obligation to feed the animals before you yourself eat. And that's why he says that if you tell someone to feed the animals, it's considered an interruption, because you don't really need to feed the animals before you partake of food. You would be allowed to partake of food before feeding the animals. That's what Rabbi Yochanan seems to hold. And therefore, he says that's an interruption. If you need salt, that's not an interruption. Again, you said hamaitzi bracha, and you did not eat yet. You interrupted your bracha without eating to say something. If you said bring salt, Rabbi Yochanan says that's fine. That if you said that, that's okay. Maybe you shouldn't do it. Preferably, you shouldn't do that. But if you did it, that's fine. But it's okay. You don't have to repeat the bracha. But when it comes to, but he says clearly, he says Gavil L'Seidri, that you'd have to repeat the bracha. That's not a necessity for the food. So he holds that you're not obligated. Now, the problem is Rav. What's the problem with Rav? Rav was the first view. Now, Rav is the source of this halacha that you're not allowed to feed animals before you're not allowed to eat food before you feed your animals. That's the name of the rabbi who says this is Rav. So one way of understanding Rav is that Rav really holds the Rav holds that you would be okay if you feeding the animals first, if you spoke to someone to feed the animals. Again, Rav says that if you tell your friend, your guest, to take from the blessed bread, that you don't have to repeat the bracha for. But if you say bring salt and bring lifton, if you tell someone to bring the salt, bring the something to make the bread taste better, that you already have, that's an interruption, because that's not a necessity. So what is Rav saying? It doesn't tell us what he would hold regarding an animal. What would he hold about an animal? If you say, feed the animals, go feed the animals. Yankele, go feed the animals fast, they're hungry. What would happen if he said that in between, before he ate the bread from his hamaitzi? He said hamaitzi, and in the middle, before he starts eating the bread, he calls out, Yankele, go feed the animals, they're hungry. What would happen? What would be the halacha according to Rav? Again, Rabbi Yochanan says clearly he's going to need to repeat the bracha, and Rav Shesha says clearly he doesn't need to repeat the bracha. Right? We have these two views. What does Rav hold? Rav, from the style of the Gemara, it seems like he would hold also that you would have to repeat the bracha. The only problem is that Rav himself is the one that says you're not allowed to eat before you feed the animals. He's the source of that halacha.
Right.
So how is he? So how are we going to learn? So, and if he holds that you don't have to repeat the bracha when you say feed the animals, why didn't he pick that example? Feed the animals, he should say you don't have to repeat the bracha. Why didn't he pick that example? And the answer is because Rav is telling us something more innovative, that feeding the animals is obvious you don't have to repeat the bracha for. Because feeding the animals, in order for you to eat, you must feed the animals first. So of course you don't have to repeat the bracha for feeding the animals. According to Rav's view, you have to feed the animals first before you eat. So for sure you don't have to repeat the bracha because you need to feed them before you eat. It's a necessity before you eat is to feed the animals. So if you said feed the animals, for sure you don't have to repeat the bracha. What Rav is saying is something innovative, that something that we wouldn't have known, that when it comes to your friend, your neighbor, your guest, and you tell him to eat, that's not a necessity for you. It's for him. He needs to eat bread because you said the bracha on it. Tell him go eat the bread. So he needs to eat the bread, but it's not you. The feeding the animals is for you yourself. Of course, you don't have to repeat the bracha. The Rav is saying even if you tell your friend to eat, that's also exempt. You don't have to repeat the bracha. You're exempt from repeating the bracha for telling your friend to eat, which is not exactly a necessity for you, but it's a necessity for your friend. That also is fine. But the feeding the animals is a necessity for you. There's no question that you don't have to repeat the bracha. That's the way some of the commentaries explain. Yes, Robert.
So this tells me something, and I want to make sure that I understand let's say the dynamic behind having to feed the animals before you satisfy your hunger is that the animals are dependent upon you because they produce the food for you to eat or drink or whatever. So as a way of self-discipline, as we read in the previous Parshat Tetzafeh, that discipline, in your being a religious Jew or recognizing what it means to be a Jew, that you have an obligation to feed those animals that are dependent on you because you may forget about them. And consequently, you don't have food, or you have less food that then provides you to have clarity of mind to be able to then continue your devotion to Hashem. I don't want it to be too complicated, right. But in any case, that tells me that, again, part of it is self-discipline, but also that the animals are dependent because they can't fend for themselves because they're not wild. And so to take care of them then allows you to enjoy the Shabbat meal because they've been satisfied. So I don't know if that makes sense to anybody else, but I thought about it.
Well, one of the reason that's given is tsar balei chayim, that an animal, either if they're seeing you eat, then for sure there could be pain that they don't have food and they're right. Seeing you eat. So that would be cruel a little, and it's
right. No, I'm sure
you're causing pain to the animal. But even not, there is a law of tsar balei chayim, even if it's not because they're seeing you eat and they're not eating. Just the fact that they're hungry is also tsar balei chayim. And so those are the, that's there might be other explanations, but that I think is the simple. So that's the simple. That's
a good explanation. Sure.
Yes.
Thank you,
Avram. But we'll look further. We'll see if there's any other. Yeah, Avraham. Yes.
Yeah. That's an observation. Though I've been Jewish for 20 years, I'm continually amazed, as I am at the moment, about the compassion that Judaism has for not only Jewish people, but right down to the goldfish. I'm amazed at this, and I want to say that how incredible it is, this religion that we adhere to in such detail as such compassion.
Wow. Well said.
Rebbe?
That's a powerful. Thank you, Abraham. Yes, Isaac.
Yeah. I had a big bracha. If I didn't feed the pets before we ate, they came to the table. So we always had to make sure, they let us know.
Rabbi.
Yes.
A couple thoughts. So one of them is, before a person has eaten, when you are still hungry, you can, let's say, empathize with someone else's hunger. I feel hungry, so I know that the other person what they feel is also hunger. I can empathize with it. Once you've satisfied yourself, it's a little harder to recognize, oh, somebody else's hunger is important and needs to be dealt with. I think that relates not just to animals, but also to, let's say, to poor people or people who are asking you for food on the street or something like that. And I think there actually may be something in halacha about that. I'm not sure. Anyway, one thought. The second thought was sort of more a question, and that is, we've got Rav, we've got Rab Sheshes, we've got Rab Yehuda. So, well, Reb Yochanan is listed as Reb Yochanan as opposed to Rav. So Rav who is Rav? How come he's only identified as Rav rather than with a name? So that's sort of two thoughts out there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So that's interesting. Why is Rav called Rav? Rav and Shmuel are two of the most famous rabbis of the Talmud. But I am lucky I have this book.
Isaac, doesn't it matter if they are from Iraq or from Israel?
There is such a Mishnah. Okay, there is a Mishnah in Idias that mentions that there's a difference.
One is Rav and one is Rabbi.
It's Rebbe and Rav. Depends where they're from. But that's not answering Simone's question. Simone is asking why someone would even have that name Rav instead of their full name. Like, where did they, now, I think it's based on a statement. I'm going to look it up, but I think it's based on a statement, Rav Tana Upalig, that Rav was considered, because he was in the generation that just changed from the Tanoim and the Amoraim, and he had that ability to argue with the Tanoim, with the earlier sages, even though most of the people after from his generation and on, they were not allowed to argue with the earlier rabbis. So therefore he got that special name of Rav. But let's take a fast look here. If it might mention an explanation of his name. Let's see. Yeah, his name was Rabbi Abba Bar Evo, or Abba Aricha, but he's commonly known as Rav, one of the most frequently cited sages in the Talmud. His appellation Rav bears testimony to the great esteem in which he was held in the entire nation, by the entire nation. He was also called Abba Aricha, the Abba the Tall, because he was the tallest man in his generation, and a native of Babylonia who studied in Eretz Yisrael. Rav was a key figure who bridged the era of Tanoim and the Amoraim. In Babylonia, he studied under his uncle Reb Chia, and then joined Reb Chia and his sons when they went to Eretz Yisrael. In Eretz Yisrael, he became a disciple of Rebbe, the redactor of the Mishnah, and may have even assisted Rebbe in his monumental project. He later returned to Babylonia, where he established the academy in Surah that lasted for 8 centuries, until the end of the Gaonic era. Rav was acknowledged as a leading sage in Babylonia. He taught thousands of students, and his teachings, rulings, and discussions are cited all over the Talmud. Together with his close colleague Shmuel, he laid the foundation for what was to become the Talmud Bavli. So it doesn't really tell us so clearly why he's called Rav, but it says it's the great esteem in which he was held by the entire nation. They called him
and
just
Shmuel,
Rav.
it makes a bigger question about Shmuel.
Right. But it's interesting. We don't say Shmuel, Tana, Upalig, even though they were at the same time. We specifically say Rav, Tana, Upalig, that Rav argued with the Tanoim. And halacha karav k'Shmuel b'mamayni and Rav b'isuri, right? What is it? Who is the halacha? Halacha
Shmuel is anything medical or anything, because he was a doctor.
Yeah, let me just tell you what it is. Halacha is karav b'isuri. Yeah, the halacha is like Rav when it comes to laws of halacha. In other words, questions of what's allowed, what's not allowed. And the halacha follows Shmuel when it comes to monetary laws. So what it sounds like, what that implies is that Rav was the expert in questions of Isser and Heter, And Shmuel was the expert in monetary laws. So maybe that answers your question, Isaac, that when it comes to Isser and Heter, that overrides the monetary laws of giving such a name. I don't know. Rav, because Rav, well, whatever. It sounds like maybe Isser and Heter might be more connected to greatness of giving the name Rav versus just monetary laws. Something to look into. So anyway, that's the story of Rav. It's interesting that it's not commonly known, I guess, his name. I don't think if you ask most Talmudic scholars if they would, many, in other words, unless someone was knowledgeable of the entire Talmud, I don't know if they would know that Rav's name is Rav Abba Bar Eva. But it must be mentioned only in a few places. The most common names in the Talmud are Rava and Abaye, and Rav and Shmuel, and almost like every page.
Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish.
Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, right. Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, and Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel in the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Meir in the Mishnah. But these are the common names. Okay, let's go back to where we were. So we were talking about this issue of feeding animals, that if there is a exemption, if you said that after you recited Hamaitzi before you partook of any food. Now, the question really is, what happens if you did tell your worker or your son, or the person who was there, your attendant, go feed the animals? Would you be allowed then to eat right then and there? Or would you have to wait until the attendant feeds the animals? So from the Gemara, it implies that you're going to just say that, not that you're going to wait until he finishes feeding all the animals. You're just saying, go feed the animals. And like you're telling someone else to go feed the animals. And it seems like you're not really dealing with it. Doesn't really say, and waiting until they finish getting fed. It doesn't say that. So the implication is that all you have to do is organize someone, arrange for someone to feed the animals, and then you would be allowed to partake of food. One of the commentaries mentions this, that the reason for it, why would this be? The reason why this would be permissible is because now the food is not on you. The food responsibility you've given over to someone else. So now they're not relying on you for the food. You've exempted yourself, and therefore it would be permissible for you to partake of food. Now, the next Gemara mentions about the salt and the lifton, and it has to do with reciting the bracha on something that's honorable, that you want the bracha to be recited on something honorable, so you want to be able to have bread that has some salt, some taste, some taste to it, and that would be the reason. We're gonna now let's start this Gemara. Amar Rava Bar Shmuel.
Rabbi, can I say one thing about the botzea?
Just 1 second. Yes.
Yeah, botzea, I looked in the dictionary, it says the one that carries out the action. In other words, the one that's going to do the cutting and separating the bread.
Right.
Right. So the action itself is called botzea. The one that
what would the other?
out,
What were you debating between? What would the other option be?
No, because I said it means separating. It doesn't mean separating. It means carrying out the action that you're going to do.
And what's the action?
The action in this case is cutting the bread.
Oh, interesting. Oh,
Yeah.
you know what? That's interesting. Someone who carries out an action is called a boitseya. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
You know where it says in the Torah?
I wanted to correct myself.
Okay. That's interesting. We're in the Torah. It says the word boitseya, betza, ma betza, hinaroi gesachinum. Ma
So
betza.
the dictionary says carrying out the actions.
Right. Okay. Very good. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Rabbi, one more
Yeah.
thought
Yeah.
before we
Yes.
leave about the
Yeah.
animals. So you've been talking mostly in the context of having pets, but I would say that probably throughout history, the context would be more that you are have animals that are working for you. You have animals that are cows and donkeys and other animals that are part of your farm, and that so once you've asked someone else to take care of it, there could be 50 cows and 150 or something, so it would make sense that you're not waiting for them all to be fed as long as someone else has taken care of it.
Well, I don't know if it makes sense or not. The question is if it fits the halacha. So the you know what I mean? Like if it's an issue of tsar balei chayim, it's an issue of causing pain, and they see you eating, you may think it would seem like it could be a problem actually. In other words, making sense that is not necessarily so. It's actually the opposite. I think it's surprising that it's allowed, but after you understand that now you're not the one that's responsible, so therefore it doesn't fall under your jurisdiction, and therefore you would be permissible to eat. After you understand the logic behind it, then you could understand it. Otherwise, it's not. Maybe you should just hire more workers. In other words, they shouldn't be waited. The animals don't deserve to, just because you have 1,000, it's not their fault. You know what I mean? And if you have 1,000 animals, it's their fault that you have 1,000, and that they're gonna have to wait 2 hours before you feed them. In other words, it doesn't really exempt you, the fact that it's going to take too long and you're going to be hungry. You know what I mean? That's not the exemption. The exemption is the fact that you're not the one responsible now, and someone else is responsible. Now, this is one of the commentaries mentions this. I don't know if, in other words, this was discussed, it seems like, in one Shilas Tshuva Sefer. And it's not a popular sefer. It's called the Keren LeDavid, and so there might be other views that might even say that it would be prohibited for you even until they finish. But I don't know of anyone that argues, so I'm just sharing this view that explains it this way, and it seems to fit with the Gemara, and that would be the reason behind it. Yes, Ben.
If she means the farmers only have to care about the animals that are in a fenced area and not grazing by themselves or not foraging for themselves, like chickens, on the range or whatever they call it, free range. So it's only animals that are caged in that you have to worry about.
I guess animals that you feed, animals that need to be fed. Yeah, right. Animals that are on their own, you don't need to feed them. There's no tsar balei chayim. There's no pain. Right. Yeah. So okay, let's continue. So the next Gemara is by the two dots. We are maybe 10 lines down from the top. Amar Rava bar Shmuel. Rava, the son of Shmuel, says, Mishum Reb Chia, in the name of Reb Chia. The person who breaks the bread, he is not allowed to. What was that? Let me mute everyone here. The person who breaks the bread, he's not allowed to break bread until every person has the either salt or lifton or some type of dip or something to eat with the bread. And the reason for that would be that it's not, the idea of everyone, the bracha is being recited, that everyone should be on bread that's going to be eaten in a respectable, honorable special way. So each person should be able to have that. Now the Gemara seems to find a contradiction. Rava bar Shmuel ikla levei reish galusa. Rava, the son of Shmuel, was traveling. He traveled to the house of Reish Galusa, the head of the leader of the exiled Jewry. So he went to his house, and apiku le rifta, they took out bread, uvatza lehedya, and he broke bread immediately, and he didn't wait for the salt or the lifton or this or dip, some dip, and that seems to contradict what he just said earlier, the line before in our Gemara. So Amru lei, so they said to him, Hadar mar mishmaitse, did Master retract from his teaching? Amar lahu less dain sarech bashesh. This bread does not need to. We don't need to wait for this bread because this is good bread, and you don't need to put it with anything else. This is very special bread that it tastes good without anything, and that's like you have these artisan breads or fancy breads, good breads that you don't really need anything. That itself is like a delicacy, and he said this bread does not need to be that you don't need to put salt or some type of a dip or anything on it.
So,
Now,
Rabbi, I thought that the salt had to do with the sacrifices, the base of Migdash, and your table is.
So that's what we're going to talk about that now.
Okay.
So the Tosfos over here deals with the custom of salt. Is it applicable nowadays? And Tosfos begins the Tosfos by talking about interruption between a bracha. You have to be careful. Certain brachas are going on a few things, so you have to be careful not to interrupt. For example, the bracha on tefillin, the bracha on the hand tefillin is also meant for the head tefillin. Therefore, a person should be careful not to interrupt. And if a person does interrupt, they would need to recite another bracha. And the same thing would apply between hamaitzi and eating, unless it has to do with the meal. If you interrupted after you said a bracha before you ate, you would have to. That's what we see clearly in the Gemara. And so only if it's something that's needed for the meal, like toil baruch. And the same thing applies to shchita. The law about shchita, slaughtering. That when they do a slaughtering, they recite one bracha for all the animals that they're going to slaughter, unless they interrupt. If they interrupt, then they would need to recite another bracha. And what would be example if they spoke and they don't need to recite another bracha? If it's something to do with the necessities of shchita, for example, if they said, are there any other animals to slaughter? Or some other, or hold tight so that it doesn't slip away when I'm trying to slaughter it. These are things that if you said them, you do not need to recite another bracha because they are necessities for the bracha. And therefore, even though you said the bracha, you're sort of interrupting with words, but these words are a necessity. Now, then Tosfos says that we don't have a custom to put on the table salt or lifton. And Tosfos says because our bread is considered chashuv, special. And it's similar to what it says about the bread in the Reish Galusa's house, that the bread was less dain sarech bashash. This bread does not need to be waited for. You don't need to because you don't need to wait for salt because it's very good bread. And Then Tosfos says, however, Reb Menachem was careful to put salt on the table because of the medrash. What does the medrash say? It says that when the Yidden are sitting at the table and they wait for each other until they wash their hands. So people are sitting there and waiting when they don't have mitzvahs. So the Satan starts up an argument against them in heaven. He prosecutes against them in heaven, and the salt, bris melach, is megan alehem. The covenant of salt, it protects us. What does that mean? The covenant of salt protects us. So it's the covenant of salt, that salt is used on the mizbeach, and we are making the table like a mizbeach, like an altar. So that salt protects us from any type of a prosecution of Satan, and therefore there is a custom that even bread that doesn't need salt, you still have salt on the table to protect us from this prosecution of Satan. So now, Kabbalistically, it's traditional not just to have salt on the table, but to actually dip the bread 3 times into salt, and that's brought in Shulchan Aruch, and it's Kabbalistic, but to dip the bread 3 times in the salt. But that's an additional, in addition to what it says here, where it says that when the salt is on the table, it sort of it saves them.
Rabbi,
Saves you from the Satan. Yes, Ben.
I thought between the time that you washed your hands and you actually take a bite of the bread, you're not allowed to say any word.
So that's what we're learning here.
They talk about some words that you can say, and you don't have to repeat the bracha.
Right. So first of all, there's 2 things. Number 1 is that you're not supposed to say any words like
Right.
you thought. You're correct about that. That you're not really supposed to say any of this. You're not supposed to say Toil Baruch or other things. But when the necessity arises, you need to say something, you said something, or you did it by mistake, then you do not need to repeat the bracha. But preferably, you should set things up that you don't have to say anything. So you should, of course, have the salt on the table before you even make kiddush. You should have it on the table. You don't have to interrupt at all anything with getting salt. But if you didn't, and you said bring the salt, then it's not considered. You don't have to repeat the bracha. So, but of course,
it says
preferably
salt for everybody. It's not just for yourself.
Well, most households, the way it works is the person who breaks bread, he dips everyone's bread in the salt. So you don't need